It is really my great honor to have the opportunity to speak with Michael Dobbs, author of this extraordinary new book called The Unwanted, America, Auschwitz, and the Village Caught in Between. And let me give Michael a sort of proper introduction so you get a sense of how lucky we are to have him here. He is a self-described recovering journalist who was a longtime reporter for the Washington Post. He was a foreign correspondent, and he covered the sort of ongoing collapse of communism in places like Yugoslavia, Poland, and the Soviet Union, and others. A notable fact, in 2007, he launched the Washington Post fact-checker column, handing out Pinocchios to lying politicians. So think about who would have imagined, right? Where we'd be today with that. He retired from the Post in 2008 to focus on teaching, researching, and writing. The Unwanted is his sixth book. His previous work has included a trilogy of histories about the Cold War, including 1 Minute to Midnight about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Since 2013, he has been on staff at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. In addition to this book, The Unwanted, he has also worked on the museum's Americans and the Holocaust exhibit, which there's going to be a touring version coming soon. Hopefully it'll be coming to Mississippi. We're working on it. So please give a warm Jackson, Mississippi welcome to Michael Dobbs. And to begin, Michael, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what inspired you to do this project.
Well, thanks very much, Stuart. And it's great to be here. I think this is the first time I've been to Jackson, Mississippi. I've been to Mississippi before, but not to Jackson. I came as a reporter for the Washington Post. Actually, I was, for a time, the education reporter. And I wrote an article about corporal punishment in schools. And to research that article and to describe, a place where it was still taking place, I came to Mississippi. I'm not sure if that's an advertisement, but I think that was my first introduction to Mississippi. But it's very good to be back here, and this is an amazing event. So I had worked as a journalist for many years. Actually, most of my working life was in communist countries, and I had the extraordinary good fortune of covering the collapse of communism as a reporter in Eastern Europe and then later in Moscow. Actually, after you've covered the collapse of communism as a reporter, your career is pretty much downhill from there. But so I ended up at the US, I didn't want to say it's downhill but it was different at any rate. I started working at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And we organized an exhibit, as Stuart said, called Americans and the Holocaust, which is about the American dimension to the American response to the rise of Hitler in Germany. And of course, part of that response was the question of refuge and immigration, which turns out to be actually quite a topical subject. So the exhibit looks at, whether or not the U.S., to what extent the U.S. admitted, how did the U.S. deal with this refugee crisis that was created as a result of the rise of Hitler in Germany. And since I'd written several books beforehand, I wanted to, write about this as an author and write about U.S. immigration policy under FDR during the rise of Hitler. Actually, quite a few books have been written about that. But my book is different in the sense that I write about the U.S. side of the policy and all the battles that were going on in Washington and the U.S. But the narrative focus is one single village in Germany, in southwest Germany. It's called Kippenheim, on the border with, across the Rhine River from Alsace. And it had a fairly significant German Jewish community, all of whom were trying to get out of Germany, particularly after Kristallnacht. It became very obvious that Jews could not survive in Germany, and everybody was trying to flee, and the place they were trying to flee to was by and large the United States. They all had applications in for American visas. So I thought that this little community would be a good vehicle for describing US immigration policy. Some succeeded in making it to the United States, and others, for various reasons, were rejected, and many of them ended up in Auschwitz. And that explains the subtitle of the book, America, Auschwitz, and a Village Caught in Between. Now, I have a couple of slides, so I'll just show one of them, which will give you an idea of the location and the village in southern Germany. Yeah, well, this is the part of Germany which we're talking about, Baden in southwest Germany. So let's continue.
So one of the things I like about the book is it is a big, complicated subject, and you found a way by focusing on a pretty small village and a relatively small Jewish community, and you're able to tell the stories of the families. So it gives it sort of a human. So is that very much part of your intention, was to try to kind of humanize this story in a way?
Yeah, I mean, this is a sort of typical approach of a journalist as opposed to an academic. And an academic will write about the statistics, the policy, but I wanted to show the impact on individual people. And because often, I particularly discover this when working as a foreign correspondent, that sometimes there's a policy debate going on in Washington that's got absolutely nothing to do with what's really happening on the ground. So I wanted to make the connection between, all these things going on in Washington and what was actually happening in the real lives of ordinary people with whom we can come to identify and to empathize. So I describe, what happened to, not only I choose this little village, Kippenheim, but I choose 2 or 3 families in the village to follow. And some make it to the US and some didn't.
And so talk about what the Kippenheim community was like, Jewish community prior to the rise of Hitler. How did they integrate?
Right.
What did they do for a living? And how that was turned on its head with the rise of the Nazis.
Right. I begin, actually, the book opens with Kristallnacht, the horrifying violence that was unleashed against the Jews of Germany in November of 1938. So I describe what happened, not actually in Germany, but what happened in this little village. A girl going to school, still a mixed Christian-Jewish school, and getting to school, and the headmaster, principal, turning on her and saying, "Get out, you filthy Jew," and then when she gets home, her house has been ransacked, her father has been taken off to a concentration camp. It's at that moment when the Jews of Kippenheim, like the Jews all over Germany, understand that there's no future for them in Germany. They have to get out by any means available. And they have all applied for American visas.
And so talk about the process. Why was the American government, the American people, resistant to opening the doors wider? I mean, what barriers stood in the way of those Jews in Kippenheim to get out? Yeah. This is a long, complicated, basically the book is all about that. But.
Yeah, I mean, I attempt to weave in the background of what was happening in the United States and how immigration policy had evolved over many years into this story of what's happening to these families that I'm looking at in particular. In order to understand US immigration policy, you have to go back to the early part of the 20th century, which is a little reminiscent, actually, of the situation today. I mean, in the 19th century, there'd been very little barriers to immigration, as a result of which the foreign-born percentage of the American population had risen to about 23%, pretty much the same as it is today, actually. And particularly after the First World War, there was a mood in the country that we don't want to let any anybody else in, or we want to be very selective in who we let in. We're no longer going to let in everybody. We're going to be extremely selective. And, for example, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act. I mean, Chinese, many Asians were excluded completely. But there were strict quotas for other nationalities, including from Europe. And so there was no refugee policy. I mean, although there was a huge refugee crisis, there was no system for admitting people whose lives were threatened, as of course the Jewish population of Germany was threatened. So people had to come in as immigrants. But in order to qualify to be an immigrant, you had to meet various tests. One of the tests being that you wouldn't be a public burden when you came into the country. So you had to prove that you had the means of support, which meant finding a sponsor. The sponsor had to sign an affidavit. So there were all these hurdles created that people trying to get into the United States, including people in imminent peril, had to negotiate. So a lot of the book is describing, what are the obstacles, how people try to overcome the obstacles, and whether they succeed or whether they don't, and to also, connect what is happening in the US with what is happening in the lives of these individual people I'm describing.
And I was struck reading the book, sort of the role of, kind of for lack of a better term, bureaucrats. People who we may not necessarily have heard of, who basically have the power of life and death, some people. So
Right.
thinking about someone like Raymond Geist, who worked, I think, in the consulate, who was tried to help and get as many Jews out as possible.
Right.
And others, like, say, Breckinridge Long, who, from a higher position in the State Department, tried to prevent that. Talk about some of the people
Right.
who perhaps aren't as well known as Franklin Roosevelt, who
Yeah.
are important in this story.
Well, you have to realize there's a struggle going on, just as there is today, over immigration policy. And that struggle is taking place at all levels of the US government. The president is kind of presiding over this, sort of balancing one faction off against another. I mean, he's not identified as much, he hadn't made keeping people out the centerpiece of his program. Actually, his wife, Eleanor, was very sympathetic to refugees. So that's one of the interesting tensions in the book, is the debate between Eleanor and Franklin over whether we should let people in. But at every level, and you mentioned Raymond Geist. Raymond Geist was the US consul in Berlin, who was pretty sympathetic. I mean, within the boundaries of US immigration law, he did what he could to help, and he understood that there was a huge humanitarian crisis in Germany, because he saw it every day. He was sitting in Berlin. And there are other people like Raymond Geist. And there are other people, you mentioned Breckinridge Long, who was the Assistant Secretary of State, who was in charge of refugee policy at this time, who it was a question of where you put the emphasis. I mean, did you put the emphasis on the need to help these people, or did you put the emphasis on the need to protect US national interests, to protect US national security? Now, one of the sort of common the parallels between today and the 1930s is the question of national security. Could refugees be used as a vehicle for Hitler inserting agents, fifth columnists, into the United States, and particularly after the fall of France in 1940. There was a kind of, the US was swept by a wave of what was called fifth column mania. Everybody suspected, anybody who spoke German in the street or was suspected of being a Nazi agent. And there were many people who thought that, the refugee flow was one way in which the Germans could infiltrate agents into the country. So this was an argument used against immigration.
Which is quite startling, because obviously by 1938 it was very clear what the Nazi government felt towards Jews, and that they in fact wanted them to leave Germany. And yet, even if you were a German Jew, in the mind of some Americans, kind of officials, you were suspect as a potential saboteur or supporter. So that seemed quite strange to me.
Well, I mean, this goes to the question of the title. The title is The Unwanted, which comes from, there was a German, slogan that was, plastered on every, outside every community in Germany. Jews are unwanted here. Juden sind hier unerwünscht. So they were unwanted in Germany, that was very clear, but were they wanted anywhere else? I write about, one of the reasons I wrote about this particular village was that there was an attempt, there was a wholesale deportation of Jews, not to the east, but to the west in October 1940. Actually, this map shows they tried to cleanse this entire area of southwest Germany, Baden, and rounded up all the Jews overnight, 6,500 of them, and sent them to France. And the French put them in a camp on the southwestern border called Gers. And they declared them undesirable, indésirable in French. So they were not wanted in Germany, they were undesirable in France. And the question is, did anybody want them in the United States either? Because, they got to France and they were all trying to get to the United States from France.
And that was interesting, is that sort of initially the sort of German idea was that they actually encouraged Jews to leave, sent them to France, and we're open to them leaving to go to places like the United States, no?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we think of the Holocaust as an extermination of the Jews, but before the German policy only turned to extermination at the end of 1941, beginning of 1942. Prior to that, the official policy had been expulsion, get rid of them all. It was only after the invasion of the Soviet Union that it turned from ethnic cleansing to wholesale extermination. So this posed a challenge to the United States and the other Western countries. Germany was, ethnically cleansing all its territories of Jews. What should you go along with this? Should you accept them? And one of the reasons I started focusing on this part of Germany was that after the deportation of these 6,500 Jews from Baden to France in 1940, the French said to the Americans, in fact, we have a cable to President Roosevelt saying, all these 6,500 Israelites, as they call them, have been, sent here. You, America, say that, the world should share the burden. How about, you helping out and taking, all these people have been dumped on us, and we haven't got the means to support them. And this posed a very difficult problem for Roosevelt and the administration, because they calculated that if they accepted the deportees, then Hitler would only be encouraged to, try the same trick in other parts of Germany, that there would be, ethnic cleansing of other parts of Germany. So the argument was we cannot cooperate with this because we cannot do anything to facilitate, deportations of Jews from Germany. It will only make matters worse.
And so talk about a little bit about what's happening in America at the time. Why were some American political leaders resistant to taking Jews, and how did the American Jewish community and its institutions respond to these challenges? Because it's a different, because the 30s was a very, very different time than we have now. I think it's important to understand.
Yeah, it's different, but in some ways it's similar. I mean, there's the arguments going on in Congress, and some of the rhetoric is very similar to the rhetoric
building a wall
today.
In one
yeah,
case,
there's a man called Senator from North Carolina, Robert Reynolds, right? And he says at one point, he's thumping the table and says, we have to build a wall to keep out all these undesirable people from entering the United States. And he's not talking about an actual wall, he's talking about a paper wall, a bureaucratic wall. But the the idea is the same. And there are various arguments used. I mean, one is the economic argument, that these people will take our jobs. Even the children eventually will grow up and become adults and compete with Americans for jobs. I mean, this is during the 30s when unemployment was much higher than it is today. And the other argument is the national security argument that I've mentioned. And it also has to be borne in mind that most public opinion polls showed that most Americans, a majority of Americans, were hostile to immigration. So all these discussions in Congress are merely reflecting this larger public sentiment that we don't want more people come into this country. There were public opinion polls, Gallup and others, taken at the time, after Kristallnacht, when it became very obvious that there was this huge refugee crisis in Europe. Should we accept these people or shouldn't we accept these people? And 70 to 80% of Americans were saying, no, we're opposed to any wider opening of the gates, any relaxation of the immigration quotas.
So you detail in, it's really a sort of compelling and tragic story of as these Jews in Kippenheim are sent to France. Essentially, they're living in refugee camps, and they're working to try to get visas. Talk about that process and how it's almost like a sort of bureaucratic, Kafkaesque, catch-22, whatever you want to describe it. But it was pretty amazing.
Right. And when I wrote about it, I've read a little bit of Kafka, and we all think of Kafkaesque, a bureaucratic nightmare. But that adjective really came to mind as I was writing about this. Because you would stand in line, all day, every day, for weeks on end, trying to fulfill all these requirements for getting a visa. And then you would get to the front of the line, and then something would happen, and you'd be back to the beginning of the line again. I mean, one family in particular that I write about, and actually I have a photograph of them being deported. If I can. I'll try to find it for you. I was interested in this family because we actually have photographs of their deportation from Kippenheim. So I followed in their footsteps. And, whenever they got to the front of the line, something would happen. For example, they were given this family, this is called the Valfa. This is called the Valfa family. Max and Fanny Valfa. Max, you see the man with the hat, he was a cigarette distributor in Kippenheim. And that's his wife, Fanny, being put onto the truck to be taken from their home in Kippenheim to the rail station to be deported to France. Actually, in the background, you can even see there's a rural community. A lot of the people were cattle raisers, or in the Jews' case, cattle dealers. You can see a farmer taking his cow down the high street there. But in any case, the Valfa family is a good example. So they got to Gers. They'd already applied for US visas back in Germany. They continued their quest in France, from Gers, in Marseille, and they were given an appointment at the US consulate in Marseille on December the 8th, 1941. They thought that everything was in order, their papers had been approved in Washington. They show up at the consulate, and everything has changed, because the day before, Pearl Harbor has been bombed, America is coming into the war. The consul tells them, your papers have to be rechecked. We're not rejecting you, but we have to recheck everything. And as a result of that, their application is postponed, and instead of getting to America, they end up being deported to Auschwitz in August of 1942, a few months later. So that's just one small example. There are many incidents like that justify this term Kafkaesque that we were talking about.
I think a lot of people are familiar with the story of the St. Louis, which was a ship that tried to port in Cuba of refugees and ended up being turned back and went to Europe. But one story that you told was a ship called the Wyoming that I actually had never heard of, and I found it to be another very interesting story. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about.
Well, the Wyoming...
Which is a ship named the Wyoming.
Right. There were lots of ships making it to America. I mean, everybody's heard about the St. Louis, but there are all these other ships also coming. And the French actually started organizing. They wanted to get rid of all these Jews that had ended up in southern France. So there's a French territory, Martinique in the Caribbean, so they got the idea that they would sort of allow people to go to Martinique. So some of the characters in my book get on the boats to Martinique. One of the boats is called the Wyoming. And, but meanwhile, the British are organizing a naval blockade, and they order the Wyoming to be intercepted because they think that this is going to help the German-French Vichy France war effort, and that they cannot allow, trade across the Atlantic between France and Martinique. So, but the problem here is that this is actually one of the escape routes for Jews from southern France. So this escape route ends up being closed down because of military action during the war.
It's only once the war truly expands and the U.S. gets involved, so the opportunities to find those ships to travel across sort of becomes much more difficult. I'm struck, obviously this is an incredible image that we have here. Talk about, how, there's also another sort of amazing image of a family portrait.
Right.
And you track what happens to each of those members of the family. Some survive, some don't. How did you get connected to these amazing images and records from Kippenheim?
Well, this goes back to the question of why I chose Kippenheim as opposed to any other. There are dozens of villages that I could have chosen. But having decided to focus on this group of 6,500 Jews who were deported from Baden to France, I then zeroed in on a village that is very well documented, and partly well documented by photographs, because there were photographs actually taken of the moment of their deportation, as you can see in the photograph behind me. So the photographs show, which we publish in the book, show several families being deported, and I tell their stories. But this particular family, the Walfer family, there's another photograph that has a picture of this very successful German Jewish family in the 1930s, at a time when, before all their property has been confiscated. And it shows the parents, Max and Fanny, and their children. And I look at what happened to, each member of the family. Actually, it's the younger members of the family who are most successful in getting out. One of the daughters leaves for America in 1936. One of the sons travels illegally to Palestine, despite the British blockade. Others end up in Britain on their way to the US. So within this family, actually the younger ones succeed in getting out, whereas the parents are still there when the war begins and the borders are closed. I think this sort of illustrates the difference actually between, there are many reasons why some people succeeded in getting out and others people didn't succeed. But one of the reasons is the generational factor, that the younger people were more determined to leave. And the older people like Max Walfer, they still, up until very late, still had, strong ties with Germany, still able to run his business up until the summer of 1938. He didn't see, he thought that Hitler would pass, that this was a passing phase of madness. And by the time they, really became serious about emigrating themselves, it was already too late.
Now, of course, one exception to that, well, on the one hand, there were some within the United States government who thought they would rather accept older rather than younger for anti-Semitic reasons. But I'm thinking about Mathilde Wertheimer, who came over, I think, at 99 or 98. Yeah. Tell that story. It's pretty amazing.
Well, there's a sort of whole debate about, which, particularly after the United States entered the war in 1941, then suddenly all these German Jews who have ended up in France are considered to be enemy aliens. I mean, they've been stripped of their German nationality by the Nazis, but in the eyes of American law, they're still German citizens. So actually, they've got the worst of both worlds, because they're considered, enemies by both sides, or potential enemies by both sides. Sorry, what was the question again?
Mathilde Wertheimer came over.
Yeah, so the question is, who should be accepted into the US? And obviously, there's a rather ugly memorandum that I came across, which said that we shouldn't accept people who can still have children, who can still do our country harm, in the sense that they would have children, and this would pose a long-term problem for the United States. But there was this lady who was 98 years old, tiny little frail lady, she could barely travel, called Mathilde Wertheimer, also from Kippenheim, who she'd survived all these terrible camps, but and in the eyes of the American consul, she was obviously not a threat. She was not a German agent. She had relatives in the United States who could look after her. So from his point of view, she was, he had no objections to helping her get out. And she traveled to the United States, actually via Casablanca, North Africa, in the summer of 1942, just a few weeks before these deportations began, arrived in the United States with her two daughters who were, in their 70s. So, she benefited from, this so-called, sort of humanitarian policy. But there are other people who, the Valfers, younger people at that point, were still, their credentials had to be checked and rechecked. They were perceived as a possible threat, whereas the 99-year-old, old lady was, not regarded as a threat. Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember that in the 1930s, that sort of virulent anti-Semitism was far more common in the United States than what we've seen, thankfully, in more recent years. But I wanted to ask you about the title, because it's subtitled America, Auschwitz, and a Village Caught in Between. And as I was reading the book, I was reading that Auschwitz isn't really in the book. Right. At the very end, it's sort of it's euphemistically called, what, to the east? Or
yeah.
So talk about what is the role of Auschwitz in the book? Almost kind of a spectral presence in a sense.
I've tried to tell the story as it actually happened, and according to the information that people had at the time. Of course, now we know about the Holocaust and we know about Auschwitz, but that information was not available to people at the time. It was not available to the American government. And they knew that terrible things were happening to the Jews, but they didn't know at the time, back in 1940, that a camp was going to be built called Auschwitz and other death camps. As you say, it's kind of more of a sort of spectral presence in the book. I don't want to jump ahead of the story, but in the end, Auschwitz is the symbol of the choices, these terrible alternatives. There's an American journalist called Dorothy Thompson, and she wrote in 1938 that she said that it's for thousands and thousands of people, the difference between life and death is a piece of paper with a stamp on it. And she didn't know about Auschwitz, and she didn't know about the Holocaust, but it was already clear to her in the middle of 1938 that people who didn't succeed in obtaining this precious document would perish one way or the other. So I don't describe what happened in Auschwitz, because everybody knows what happened in Auschwitz, but I describe the events leading up to Auschwitz, and the book ends, actually there's a final chapter about, memory, but the actual narrative ends with the rounding up of foreign Jews in Germany in the summer of 1942 and their deportations to Auschwitz. I don't describe what happened once they got to Auschwitz, because I think, we all know that.
So one of the ways that we sometimes think is we look back at history and we see a sort of inevitability, that the way things unfold is the way that they were destined to unfold. And sort of reading this book, I was thinking, what could we have done differently? Could we have avoided the sort of results, not in terms of the Holocaust, that's a deeper question, but in terms of somehow enabling more people to get out? Were there points along the way that you sort of, as you wrote this book, say, well, if this had been different, more people could have been saved, or was it inevitable?
You mean
That's a hard question.
as far as U.S. policy is concerned?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, of course,
Could
we could have
opened...
let more people in.
Yeah.
I mean, whether we could have, opened our doors completely, or would ever have opened our doors completely to everybody trying to get in, I mean, probably not. I mean, obviously, these people, particularly the Valfa, I describe many cases in the book where people could have been allowed into the US without, their lives could have been saved without that posing any threat to US national security. I mean, undoubtedly the case. Could millions have been saved? I doubt it. I mean, the problem was that, actually German Jews, the survival rate was about 70%. The German quota was fairly generous compared to the quotas for other East Europeans.
And the quotas from the 1924 law didn't make a distinction between Jews and non-Jews. A German was a German. Yeah.
So they could come in as Germans. So the quota system actually, in a bizarre kind of way, favored German Jews. I mean, East European Jews were in a completely different situation, particularly Polish Jews. I mean, the quotas for Poland was much smaller than for German Jews. But the question then was, okay, so how could, with hindsight, of course, most Jews who were killed in the Holocaust were Polish Jews, and some succeeded in getting out, particularly the people with wealth and resources. But was that a reason? I mean, Poland was an independent country up until the invasion by Germany in 1939. And then the borders were shut. So could we have saved millions of Polish Jews? I don't think so. But we could certainly have saved tens of thousands. And for each individual person, each individual life, of course, is important.
One of the real strengths, I think, of your book is you really tell the stories of the Jews in Kippenheim, and you really go into the families. But one of the most interesting characters, I thought, and I'd love you to tell that story, isn't a person, but it's a building, is the synagogue in Kippenheim. Tell that story and how it, at the end, what they've done in Kippenheim.
Well, this sort of this is all about the recovery of memory, because the Kippenheim synagogue was trashed during Kristallnacht. It wasn't burned down, actually, because there were Christian houses next door, so they didn't burn it down, they just trashed it. And then it was turned into an agricultural warehouse. So at the end of the war, when the Nazi government collapsed, of course, there were all these abandoned synagogues all over Germany, and there were in places like Kippenheim, there were no Jews. So in Kippenheim, they had this building which had sort of lost any religious purpose, that the Jewish community of Germany sold to some company connected with the mayor, who turned it into an agricultural warehouse. So basically there was amnesia. Everybody forgot about it. Nobody wanted to discuss this for years and years, for decades. It was only in the 70s, partly as a result of the student revolutions of the 70s, the ferment, the Germans themselves began asking questions, and they began asking questions about their own history. And among that took time for that to percolate down into villages like Kippenheim. But then there was a movement to recover their own history. And part of that movement was to re-establish contact with these Jewish communities that had been destroyed and driven out of the country. And some local activists, historians, became passionate about rediscovering the past. And part of that was to restore and renovate the synagogue. So now, actually, I think it was the renovation of the Kippenheim synagogue was completed in 1990 or so. Many former Jewish families from Kippenheim were invited back. There's one in particular called Kurt Meyer. He's now 90 years old, but he goes back to Kippenheim every year at the invitation of local churches and schools to give talks in the region. So, I end the book with this, what I call the rediscovery of memory. Actually, there's a parallel here because the same thing is happening in the United States. There's a debate in the United States beginning in the late 70s and 80s about immigration policy and whether or not how we responded to the Holocaust and to this refugee crisis that in many ways is still going on today. But for 30, 40 years, wasn't a topic. Nobody really wanted to talk about that. It's only later that it became a topic.
Yeah. That last chapter about the kind of reclaiming kind of the history, a very, very difficult history on the parts of Germans, I think is very, very compelling, and I think has some lessons for us to learn here in Mississippi as well, because, to a less extreme extent, of course, but we have our own difficult history. Before we go to questions, I want you to just kind of get your thoughts, and you've kind of alluded to it, but one can't, in fact, I was curious, it seemed like you started, that you worked on this project before the recent political developments that suddenly make the issue of refugees and immigration becoming really salient. So I'm wondering, as you publish the book, what parallels do you see between our current debates over refugees and immigration and what went on back in the 30s?
I mean, I've written a history book, and it's not my purpose to comment on current events, partly because I work for the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, which is an agency of the US government. So
fair point.
But it's beyond that, because really, I didn't want to write a polemical book about, what's happening in America today. I mean, people can read the book and they will come to different conclusions about, immigration, and the extent to which America should allow, desperate people into the country. It's a valid debate. You can reach different conclusions about that. But I didn't want to enter into that debate. I wanted to write a historical book that describes what happens. I think it would have reduced the value of the book if I had suddenly had a final. I mean, whether or not, I was inhibited by my position working for the museum, probably even if I had no affiliation with the museum at all, I would not have wanted to have made it into a polemical current day politics book. I prefer, in all the books that I've written have been about, a historical period, providing information to people that they can use to, certainly sheds a light on current debates. But I don't want to tell people what to think. I want for them to think about these questions for themselves, rather than for me to, give ready-made answers.
Well, and I can certainly attest that this book does make you think in very, very deep ways. There's a little bit of time left. I'll be happy to have some questions. Yes, sir, in the back. And please stand up so we can capture as much, hear you as best we can.
Sure. How do you view people like Sumner Wells, John McCloy, David Rockefeller's influence on Roosevelt, not just in the bombing of the chemical plants around Auschwitz, but also in the acceptance of immigrants from Europe?
Yeah, there are all these people around the president, and some are arguing for more liberal policy, and some are arguing for a more restrictive policy. And in the center is President Roosevelt, who's very much a politician. He's sort of juggling, he would never reveal himself completely. He liked to play off one set of advisors against another set of advisors. He once said, "I'm a juggler, and I don't let my left hand know what my right hand is doing." So you can see at different times he sides with different factions in the government. At some points he's more sympathetic to the people who want to relax the immigration laws, and other times he's more, actually as time goes on, he becomes more focused on winning the war and less interested in the humanitarian aspect. And by 1941, 1942, he's really completely focused on the war. And the humanitarian aspect, which his wife, particularly Eleanor, is still pushing. And you can see a divergence between them. I mean, I think in many ways Franklin actually shares many of Eleanor's basic ideas, but he's a politician. He's juggling all these different pressures on him. And his overriding goal is to bring America into the war and then to win it. It's not to save, individual lives. He's not thinking about individual lives, actually.
In other words, he was bored.
Sorry?
In other words, he was bored.
It's not bored.
No, he definitely wasn't bored. There's plenty going on, I think.
Right.
Are there any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
During World War II, Shanghai was an open port.
Yeah.
You don't hear much about the Jewish people who went to Shanghai.
Yeah.
What part of Germany did they come from? Or
Right.
did they come from Austria?
I think they came from all over Germany. I mean, you're right in saying that Shanghai was one of the ways out, and people, actually none of the people from the village that I'm looking at went to Shanghai, but they certainly considered it as an option. It was the one place that was still accepting refugees without many questions. And there's so many, the thing about the Holocaust and any book about the Holocaust is and even about, this question of immigration and refuge, is there's so many aspects to it. You could get lost if you sort of try to follow every aspect. So I tried to tell the story of these particular families, which actually covers quite a lot of ground. I mean, one of my families is on have people on the St. Louis, so I talk about St. Louis in some detail. I talk about kinder transport to Britain because one of the families puts a child onto a kinder transport to Britain. But I don't talk about Shanghai because purely for the reason that, it's important, but it's not part of the story that of the little community that I'm looking at.
Any other questions? Sir.
In your earlier statement, you alluded to the German policy of deportation in the late 30s. They were deporting Jewish people. The policy changed, and if I heard you correctly, upon Soviet invasion, that policy changed. Would it be fair to say that the policy changed from deportation to annihilation based strictly on logistics, expediency, rather than some deeply held political belief?
Well, there's a huge debate among historians about when exactly the Holocaust, Hitler decided on extermination, and some historians put it earlier, some historians put it later. But the fact is, there were 500,000 Jews in Germany. You could, if you were Hitler, you could deal with that problem as he saw it by expulsion. Once he invaded Poland, Eastern Europe, he suddenly had millions and millions of Jews on his hand. So when they invaded the Soviet Union, they just, the idea of expulsion as a solution from their point of view evaporated. They started killing people en masse. That's why the Holocaust begins in Eastern Europe with the, particularly the invasion of Russia.
Yeah. One last question. An estimation of how many Holocaust survivors are still alive? Approximately.
Well, one question is, what is a Holocaust survivor? At the museum, we have a very broad definition of somebody who survived the Holocaust. It doesn't have to be, somebody who was in the camps. It can be anybody who survived these terrible events. For example, a child who's survived by her parents put her on a train to London, one of the Kindertransport. But of course, if you just think about, there are fewer and fewer, of course, and this generation is disappearing, and this is one of the challenges that the museum faces, is that there are fewer and fewer witnesses. Kurt Meyer is a good example. He was, I write about him in the book. He's now, he was 10 years old when he was born in 1930. He was deported to France in 1940, so that what makes him now 88, right? So he's one of the lost ones. And this is going to be one of the challenges, in the years ahead, is that, this generation that finally, was persuaded to talk about their experiences, many of them, in many cases, towards the end of their lives, are now leaving us. I don't have a number. There is, you can probably find out that, a rough number.
But certainly fewer and fewer all the time. Yes, sir.
You ever heard of the SIS? Roosevelt started it. It was the first Black Ops secret organization.
The OSS, you mean?
Yeah. SIS. Okay. He used the White House budget to help fund it. Mm-hmm. And it was ran by a Mississippi FBI agent who worked his way up, to the hierarchy and all. And then when the war broke out, when Roosevelt declared war, he went before the Congress to legitimize the SIS. It's what led the Italians and Germans and the Japanese, to be rounded up and all.
Mm-hmm. I'm not familiar with that story. But it was interesting, and I'm not going to ask you the name of it, but I did note that in the book there was an example of someone who was able to get out thanks to the intercession of a Mississippi congressman. And so right. I don't remember which,
did I mention the name of the congressman?
No, you didn't.
Actually, what's very interesting with these congressmen, when their cases were blocked, one way they tried to resolve the cases was to have a relative or a friend in the United States write to a congressman. And then the congressman would write to the State Department, and the State Department would look at the case, and that would unblock it. What's very interesting is that some of the members of Congress, including Senator Reynolds, who were most opposed to immigration in the abstract, they were actually helping their individual constituents. When somebody came to them and said, look, we have a relative who's trying to get out of Germany, will you do something to help? In that case, when they're faced with an individual, even the most venomous anti-immigration members of Congress would often help. I don't know which side this Mississippi, whether he was pro or anti-immigration, but there was a kind of disconnect between their general political views and their willingness, what they thought of helping individuals, which I guess is encouraging.
Well, it's actually a really important larger point that if you see someone as a human and you understand them as a human, it's much easier to have empathy than if you see them as a broad group. And I think that's a really wonderful example of it. We've got time for maybe one last question, if there is one. If not, I'm sure Michael will love to stick around and chat with you. I think you're also on the panel for World War II later this afternoon, so if you'd like to hear some more. So please thank you, Michael, for speaking with us.